My name is Daniel Mercer, and I learned something that night in the National Forest that I still struggle to explain without my hands shaking. The forest does not give up its secrets easily, but sometimes it leaves digital breadcrumbs behind, scattered and silent, waiting for someone desperate enough to follow them. I entered the forest just before sunset, late enough that the ranger station was already closed, early enough that I told myself I could still make good time. I had hiked this section before, or at least I thought I had. The map showed a maintained trail looping east, then south, before reconnecting with a service road. Simple, familiar. That confidence stayed with me for about an hour. As daylight thinned, the woods began to change in small, almost reasonable ways. Sounds dulled. The air cooled faster than expected. The smell shifted from pine and dry leaves to something wetter, heavier, like soil that hadn't seen sunlight in a long time. My boots started sinking slightly with each step. I checked my GPS. The signal blinked, reappeared, then drifted a few degrees off before correcting itself again. I told myself not to panic. Panic is what turns small mistakes into missing person reports. By the time full darkness settled in, the trail markers were harder to spot. My headlamp cut a narrow tunnel through the trees, the beam swallowed by bark and undergrowth after a few yards. Everything outside that cone felt like pressure, as if the forest was leaning inward, listening. Every time I stopped walking, the silence felt wrong, not peaceful, but unfinished, like a breath being held. I reached a fork that didn't exist on my map. The left path sloped downward into thicker brush. The right climbed gently and looked more traveled. I stood there longer than I should have, comparing shadows, studying scuffed dirt and broken twigs like they might confess which direction belonged to me. When I finally chose right, it was based on nothing more than relief. Relief always feels like a decision when you're tired. 15 minutes later, the trail vanished. Not ended, not narrowed. It simply stopped, dissolving into leaf litter and moss as if it had never been there at all. My headlamp swept back and forth, catching tree trunks, roots, uneven ground, but no sign of passage. I turned around, certain I'd find the fork behind me. There was nothing. No fork, no clear path. Just trees, packed tight, their branches overlapping in ways I didn't remember walking through. I checked my GPS again. This time it refused to lock. The screen showed my position floating several hundred yards off any marked trail, blinking like it wasn't confident I existed. I tried to retrace my steps anyway. I counted paces. I marked trees with the beam, memorizing scars in the bark, bent limbs, anything that felt distinct. 10 minutes of walking brought me back to the same patch of ground, recognizable only because of a fallen log shaped like a crooked spine. The smell there was stronger, damp and sour, like water trapped under rot. That was when I noticed the camera. It was strapped to a tree about chest height, angled slightly downward. At first, I thought it was just another shadow, but the shape was wrong, too rectangular, too deliberate. I stepped closer and felt a strange flicker of relief. A trail camera meant people, hunters, activity, proof that this place wasn't as empty as it felt. The camera was old, scratched, the casing faded from years of weather. A thin layer of grime dulled the lens. The strap had started to fray, fibers stiff with age. A small red indicator light blinked once as I passed in front of it, then went dark again. That blink felt like being acknowledged. I stood there longer than necessary, listening. No footsteps, no voices, just the faint hiss of my own breathing and a distant sound that might have been wind, or might have been something moving slowly through brush far away. The forest smelled different here, metallic and cold, like rain without the rain. I unlatched the camera carefully, half expecting an alarm, or for it to fall apart in my hands. Didn't. It was heavier than I expected, solid. I flipped it open and found a memory card still inside. I remember laughing quietly to myself then, a short, nervous sound. I told myself this was good luck. Evidence. If someone had hunted here, they'd marked paths, checked angles, returned again and again. Somewhere in those images was context, direction, a way out. I checked the timestamp on the camera's small screen. The last recorded image was dated 3 years earlier. Same month, same week, same night. That detail pressed against me in a way I couldn't explain. I told myself it was coincidence, the way you do when your brain is trying to stay functional. I powered the camera back on and scrolled through the files. Most were corrupted, thumbnails broken into blocks of static and dark smears. Some showed empty forest. Some showed animals caught mid-step, eyes reflecting infrared light, bodies stretched thin by motion blur. Then there were the others. Frames where something stood just outside the center, partially cut off, as if the camera had been nudged at the last second. A sleeve, a shoulder, a boot toe inches from the lens. The timestamps between those images were erratic, jumping minutes, then hours, then seconds apart, like the clock itself couldn't hold steady. My fingers went numb as I scrolled. One image froze me in place. It showed a man, facing the camera, close enough that his breath must have fogged the lens. He wore a hunting jacket, the fabric dark with moisture. His face was pale, eyes wide, unfocused, as if he'd been staring into the flash instead of the forest around him. His mouth was open slightly, not shouting, not smiling, just waiting. The next image was taken 2 seconds later. He was gone. The forest in the background looked unchanged, but the camera angle had shifted a few degrees, tilted downward, as if something had brushed past it on the way by. The red indicator light blinked again, once, steady, patient. I lowered the camera and realized how quiet it had become. No insects, no distant movement. Even the wind had faded, leaving a pressure in my ears like altitude change. The smell of damp earth thickened, crawling into my lungs. I don't know how long I stood there before I noticed the sound behind me. Not footsteps, not quite. More like the careful displacement of leaves, measured and slow, stopping every time my breathing hitched. I turned, heart hammering, headlamps slicing through the dark. There was nothing in the beam, but somewhere just beyond it something had learned how to wait. I kept the headlamp steady, refusing to sweep it wildly. Panic loves movement. Whatever was behind me seemed to understand that, because the sound didn't advance. It matched me. When my breath slowed, it paused. When my boot shifted in the leaves, something answered with a faint compression of ground, careful enough to sound accidental. I backed toward the tree with the camera, keeping my eyes forward. The strap brushed my wrist, rough and brittle. I swallowed, forcing air into my lungs through my nose, cataloging details like I'd read in survival guides. Temperature dropping, slight breeze from the north, no obvious animal calls, no smell of musk or wet fur. That last part bothered me more than it should have. I clipped the camera to my pack and stepped sideways, then forward, choosing a direction at random. The forest accepted the decision without resistance. Too easily. The ground sloped gently downward, leaves thinning to bare soil in patches that felt pressed flat, as if by repeated foot traffic. I told myself that meant people. Hunters. A forgotten route back to something recognizable. The GPS chirped once, a weak sound, then went silent again. I walked for what felt like 20 minutes, counting steps, touching tree trunks as I passed to keep orientation. The smell followed me, metallic and damp, stronger now, like old rain trapped under bark. My ears rang with the absence of sound. Even my clothes seemed louder than they should have been, fabric whispering with each movement. That was when the camera activated again. A soft click. The red indicator light blinked, reflecting off a nearby trunk. I froze. The camera was facing forward, strapped to my pack, angled backward over my shoulder. That meant it had detected movement behind me. I didn't turn. Instead, I reached back slowly, fingers numb, and unhooked the camera. I lowered it to the ground and angled it toward the darkness I'd come from, then took 2 careful steps away. The forest remained still, but the pressure in the air shifted, subtle and undeniable, like a room rearranging itself when you weren't looking. The camera clicked. I crouched beside it and scrolled through the newest file. The image showed my back, hunched and small in the beam of my headlamp. Beyond me was nothing but black, the infrared unable to find detail. I waited, breath shallow, and refreshed the screen. Another image appeared, time-stamped 2 seconds later. Something stood where I had been. Not close enough to resolve clearly, but close enough to disrupt the background. A distortion in the darkness, like heat haze without heat. The outline suggested a human shape only because my brain insisted on it. There were limbs, maybe, but the proportions felt wrong, stretched or compressed by angle and shadow. I backed away until a tree stopped me. Bark pressed into my spine. The smell surged, sharp now, like cold metal scraped against stone. My ears popped, a brief rush of pressure, and then the forest exhaled. The sound returned all at once. Insects, wind through leaves, a distant branch snapping under weight that didn't try to hide anymore. I ran, not blindly, but fast enough that my thoughts lagged behind my legs. The ground dipped and rose, roots snagging my boots, branches tearing at my sleeves. I didn't look back. I couldn't afford the image that would leave behind my eyes. I ran until my chest burned and my vision tunneled, then forced myself to stop, hands on knees, gasping. The headlamp beam shook wildly, scattering shadows. When I steadied it, I saw something ahead that didn't belong. A structure, low, rough, half swallowed by brush. A hunting blind, old and weathered, boards gray with age. It leaned slightly, one corner sunk into the earth. Relief hit me so hard I laughed again. Louder this time, the sound cracking in my throat. I approached cautiously. The blind smelled of rot and old fabric, of time layered thick. Inside, the floor was littered with spent shells, their brass dulled. A folding chair lay collapsed in one corner. Scratches marked the inner walls, shallow but numerous, as if someone had dragged their fingers along the wood repeatedly. I set the camera on the floor and checked the files again, heart pounding. More images had been captured during my run. Blurred frames of movement, trees bending into streaks. Then one clear shot, the blind, taken from outside, angled inward, as if the camera had been carried here before. The timestamp placed it years ago, same night, minutes after the man in the hunting jacket vanished from the frame. I swallowed hard and scrolled forward. The next image showed the inside of the blind, empty except for the chair. The next showed the chair upright, positioned to face the narrow viewing slit. The next showed the chair tipped backward, legs in the air, as if knocked over. The last image froze my blood. The blind, empty again, but with deep impressions in the dirt floor, parallel grooves leading toward the back wall, stopping just short of the boards. There was no exit there, just wood and earth. I sat on the floor, back against the wall, knees drawn up, trying to slow my breathing. The camera rested heavy in my hands. Whatever had happened to the hunter hadn't been sudden. It had been documented piece by piece, by a device that didn't care about fear, only movement and time. Outside, something brushed the blind. Not hard, just enough to make the boards creak. I held my breath, The smell seeped in through the gaps, cold and metallic, filling my mouth. The camera clicked again. I looked down. The newest image showed the inside of the blind. Me crouched against the wall, eyes wide in the glare of infrared, and behind me, pressed close enough to share my shadow, the faint suggestion of a face where the wood should have been, waiting for the next timestamp to decide what came next. I dropped the camera like it had burned me. It hit the dirt floor with a dull thud, the plastic casing rattling softly before settling. For a moment, nothing happened. No movement outside. No sound except my pulse in my ears and the thin creak of the blind adjusting to the night air. I forced myself not to turn around. The image was already in my head. If I looked and confirmed it, something would change. I didn't know what, only that the waiting would end. I shifted my weight slowly, inching sideways along the wall, keeping my back pressed tight to the boards. The wood felt colder than it should have, damp in places, rough enough to bite into my jacket. The smell was stronger here, concentrated, like rust soaked into fabric and left to sit for years. Each breath tasted wrong. Outside, the forest had gone quiet again. Not the natural quiet from earlier, but something tighter, deliberate. Even the wind seemed to avoid the blind, curling around it instead of passing through. I reached down without looking and slid the camera closer with the side of my boot. The red indicator light blinked once, then went dark. I stared at the floor, at the grooves in the dirt I hadn't noticed before. Parallel marks, shallow but distinct, running from the center of the blind toward the wall behind me. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old enough to have softened back into the soil either. They stopped inches from the boards. I swallowed and slowly leaned forward, peering at the wood where the grooves ended. There were scratches there too, faint but numerous, clustered at about shoulder height. Someone had pressed against this wall, repeatedly, hard enough to leave marks but not hard enough to break through. A soft sound came from outside, not footsteps, more like the gentle settling of weight, as if something had leaned in close to listen. The boards creaked again, answering that pressure. The camera clicked. I closed my eyes, counted to 3, then picked it up. The new image showed the blind from the outside. My headlamp beam spilled through the narrow slit, a pale triangle against the dark. The timestamp was current. The angle was wrong, too close to the wall, too low, like the camera had been placed on the ground, pointed upward. I scrolled forward. Another image loaded, clearer than the rest. The camera was inside again, angled toward the back wall. The grooves in the dirt were darker, deeper, as if something had pressed into them recently. My reflection hovered faintly in the corner of the frame, distorted by infrared glare. I didn't scroll to the next image. Instead, I powered the camera off. The silence that followed felt heavier, as if the forest had noticed the interruption. The pressure in my ears returned, sharp enough to make me wince. I shifted my jaw, trying to equalize, but it didn't help. The smell thickened, filling the blind completely now. I had to leave. I eased toward the entrance, moving inch by inch, listening for any change in the air. When my hand brushed the edge of the opening, I froze. The night beyond looked wrong. Not darker, just flatter. Depth collapsed, distance compressed into overlapping layers of shadow that refused to separate. I stepped out anyway. The forest greeted me with sound again, but it felt forced, like a recording played too loud. Insects chirped out of rhythm. Leaves rustled without wind. Somewhere nearby, a branch snapped with slow deliberation. I turned my headlamp in a slow arc, careful not to rush it. Trees crowded close, their trunks forming irregular lines that shifted as my light passed over them. The ground sloped downward, same as before, but now it felt intentional, guiding. I took one step away from the blind. Behind me, the boards creaked, longer this time, as if something inside had leaned forward, disappointed. I walked, not fast, not slow, just steady enough to keep my breathing under control. I followed the slope, trusting nothing but the way the ground felt under my boots. Every few steps, I stopped and listened. Each time, the forest answered with silence just long enough to feel personal. After what felt like an hour, the terrain changed. The soil grew firmer. Rocks appeared underfoot, small at first, then larger, clustered in uneven patches. My headlamp caught the faint outline of a path, barely visible, worn into the earth by use or erosion. I didn't question it. I followed. The trail camera stayed off in my hand, heavier with every step. I didn't want to see what it would show now. The path curved gently, then straightened. The trees thinned. Ahead, a faint glow cut through the dark, weak but unmistakable. Artificial light. I stopped, heart pounding, afraid it would vanish if I acknowledged it. Didn't. I moved faster, careful but urgent. The glow sharpened into a line, then a shape. A service road, narrow and cracked, reflecting my headlamp back at me. Beyond it, a reflector post stood crooked, its surface scratched but intact. I stepped onto the road and felt something lift. Not relief exactly, but release like pressure easing off a wound. The forest noise resumed its natural rhythm. Wind moved through the trees properly now. My ears stopped ringing. I didn't stop walking until the trees were well behind me. When I finally did, I sat on the edge of the road, back against the gravel, and laughed until my chest hurt. The sound echoed too far, too loud, but nothing answered it. I powered the camera on again. The screen flickered, then displayed the last image captured. It showed the blind, empty board still. The timestamp matched the moment I stepped onto the road. In the corner of the frame, barely visible, was the hunting jacket hanging limp over the back of the chair, as if someone had just stood up and walked away, leaving it behind to be remembered by a machine that never learned how to forget. I stayed on the road longer than I needed to, pacing its narrow strip of gravel as if movement alone could keep whatever had followed me from remembering my shape. The road felt thin, fragile, like a promise made without witnesses. Beyond its edges, the forest pressed close, trees lining up too neatly, their shadows overlapping in ways that made distance hard to judge. The air smelled cleaner here. Cold, yes, but no longer metallic. Each breath filled my chest without resistance. I checked my watch. Just after midnight. Time hadn't broken. That detail mattered more than it should have. I told myself to follow the road downhill. Service roads always lead somewhere eventually. Gates, trailheads, ranger sheds. I didn't think about how long it might take. I focused on the rhythm of my steps, the crunch of gravel under my boots, the steady swing of the headlamp beam. Behind me, the forest remained silent. After 10 minutes, the road curved sharply left. My headlamp swept across the bend and caught something reflective on the ground. Not a sign, not glass, fabric. I stopped. The object lay half on the gravel, half in the dirt where the road met the trees. A jacket, dark, heavy, soaked through with age and moisture. I recognized it immediately, the hunting jacket from the camera. I didn't touch it. The jacket looked wrong here, too deliberate, laid out as if someone had wanted it to be found. One sleeve pointed toward the forest, the other toward the road. The fabric was stiff, the pockets sagging with weight. The smell crept back in, faint but unmistakable. I backed away slowly, every instinct screaming not to turn my back on the trees. The jacket didn't move. Nothing did. The road stretched ahead, pale and uncertain. I chose not to look at the jacket again. I walked past it, eyes fixed forward, pulse thudding in my throat. When I was several yards beyond, I dared a glance over my shoulder. The jacket was gone. There were no drag marks, no footprints, just undisturbed gravel and dirt, as if it had never been there at all. My stomach tightened, and I forced myself to keep moving. The road began to descend more steeply. My ears popped again, pressure shifting without altitude to justify it. The headlamp flickered once, then steadied. I tightened my grip on the camera, its plastic edges digging into my palm. The forest noise changed gradually, not vanishing, but thinning. Insects quieted. Wind faded. By the time I realized it, I was walking inside another pocket of silence, deeper than before. The road ended without warning. Not at a gate or junction. It simply dissolved back into dirt and leaf litter, swallowed by the trees. My headlamp traced the last stretch of gravel, then nothing beyond it. No markers, no signage, just forest. I stood there, heart pounding, fighting the urge to scream. I checked the GPS again. This time it locked instantly. My position blinked on the screen, steady and precise, several hundred yards north of where the road should have been. According to the map, I was standing in unbroken woodland. I laughed once, sharp and humorless, and turned in a slow circle. The forest watched back, patient. The camera vibrated faintly in my hand. I hadn't turned it on. The red indicator light blinked, then blinked again, steady as a heartbeat. I raised the camera without thinking, thumb hovering over the power button. The smell surged, stronger than before, filling my nose and mouth. My ears rang. The pressure built behind my eyes, making the edges of my vision blur. I powered the camera on. The screen showed a live view. Infrared washed the forest in pale gray. Trees stood too close together, their trunks overlapping unnaturally in the frame. The timestamp pulsed, unstable, flickering between times that meant nothing. Then a shape moved, not toward me, not away, across the frame, sliding laterally between trees without disturbing branches or undergrowth. The outline shifted as it moved, thinning, thickening, never quite resolving. Where a face should have been, there was only a darker absence, like a hole cut into the image. The camera clicked. The live view froze into a still image. In it, I was visible at the edge of the frame, turned slightly, caught mid-breath. Behind me, closer than it should have been, the shape leaned in, its outline pressed into the space where my shadow fell. I dropped the camera again and staggered backward, nearly losing my footing. The forest answered with a sound I hadn't heard yet that night. A voice. Not words. Not a call. Just the rough approximation of breath pushed through a throat that didn't use it often. It came from everywhere at once, layered and uneven, rising and falling like someone testing a lung. I ran, this time without restraint. Branches tore at my face. Roots sent me stumbling. I didn't care. I followed instinct, momentum, anything that felt like escape. The sound followed, not chasing, just keeping pace, matching my speed without effort. Light appeared ahead again, sudden and blinding. I burst out of the trees onto a wide gravel lot, skidding to a stop on loose stone. A building loomed in front of me, dark but solid. A closed ranger outpost. Its windows reflected my headlamp back at me, empty and unresponsive. I spun, scanning the tree line. The forest stopped at the edge of the lot, its shadows refusing to cross the open space. The sound faded, thinning into nothing. The smell vanished. I collapsed against the building's wall, sliding down until I was sitting on the cold ground, lungs burning, vision swimming. I didn't move for a long time. When my hands stopped shaking, I picked up the camera one last time. The screen showed no new images, But the timestamp continued to count upward, steady now as if satisfied. Somewhere behind me, inside the forest, something had decided the night wasn't finished yet. The headlights slowed as they crossed the lot, their beams cutting clean, confident paths through the dark. A ranger truck rolled to a stop a few yards away, engine idling, the sound grounding in a way nothing else that night had been. The driver's door opened, boots hit gravel. A flashlight beam swept once, twice, then settled on me. "Sir?" A voice called, human and strained. "Don't move." I didn't argue. I couldn't have if I wanted to. My legs felt hollow, like they'd already decided they were done for the night. The ranger approached carefully, eyes flicking between me and the tree line, hand resting near his radio. "You alone?" he asked. "Yes," I said. My voice sounded wrong to my own ears, too thin, scraped raw by cold and fear. He nodded, not fully convinced, and gestured for me to come closer to the truck. I moved slowly, deliberately, keeping my hands visible. The forest stayed still. No sound, no pressure. The light held. They wrapped me in a blanket and sat me on the tailgate. Another ranger joined us, younger, quieter, her gaze fixed on the trees beyond the lot. They asked the usual questions. Name, where I'd entered, how long I'd been missing. I answered as best I could, careful with details that felt too fragile to survive daylight. When they asked how I'd found the outpost, I hesitated. "There was a road," I said finally. For a while, they exchanged a look that told me everything they didn't say. The older ranger cleared his throat. "There hasn't been a service road here for years. They drove me out just before dawn, the forest receding in the rearview mirror, trees losing their edges as the sky lightened. I watched until the road curved and the outpost vanished behind us. Only then did my hands start shaking again. At the station, they took my statement. I left out the shapes, the pressure, the sound that wasn't breath. I talked about getting turned around, about finding an old hunting blind, about the trail camera that got their attention. They asked to see it. I handed it over reluctantly, a strange sense of loss twisting in my chest as it left my hands. The younger ranger turned it on, scrolled through the files. Her brow furrowed. The older ranger leaned in closer. Most of the images were gone. Not deleted, corrupted. Blocks of static where frames should have been. Animals dissolved into noise. Empty forest reduced to dark smears. The timestamps jumped erratically, refusing to line up with anything meaningful. But not all of them. The image of the hunter was still there. Pale face, open mouth, waiting eyes. The ranger stiffened when she saw it. "That's him," she said quietly. "That's the guy." They found the missing person notice in their records. Same photo, same jacket, same night 3 years ago. Last ping from his phone somewhere east of the outpost. Never recovered. They asked if I'd found any belongings. I shook my head. They didn't press. I was released later that morning with a ride to my car and a warning about hiking alone. The forest looked harmless in daylight. Birds moved through the trees. Sunlight filtered through leaves, touching everything gently, as if the night had never happened. I drove home without stopping. For a week, I didn't sleep properly. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that pressure behind them, the sense of being measured, observed. My apartment felt too quiet, every sound too sharp. I kept lights on. I checked corners. I avoided reflective surfaces. The trail camera sat on my kitchen table. They'd given it back to me, apologetic. "Evidence," they said, without explaining what kind. They told me it probably belonged to the hunter, that it would go into storage unless I wanted it. I told them I did. I don't know why. On the 8th night, just after midnight, the camera clicked. I was awake, sitting on the couch, lights on, windows closed. The sound came from the kitchen. I didn't move at first. I listened. No pressure, no smell, just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant rush of traffic outside. I stood slowly and walked toward the table. The camera's red light blinked, steady and familiar. I turned the screen toward me. The newest image showed my kitchen. Same angle, same light. Me standing in the doorway, caught mid-step, face pale, eyes wide. Behind me, reflected faintly in the dark window glass, was the suggestion of a shape that didn't belong to the room. I powered the camera off with shaking fingers. The apartment stayed quiet. I didn't sleep that night. Over the next few days, I tried to get rid of it. I took it to an electronics recycler. The clerk shook his head. Too old, he said. I left it at a donation center. It showed back up on my doorstep the next morning, placed neatly beside the mat. No note, no explanation. I wrapped it in towels and shoved it into the back of a closet. For a while, that worked. The clicking stopped. The nights grew easier. I started to believe distance mattered, that whatever had watched me was bound to that forest, to that place where the light drew lines it wouldn't cross. Then I noticed the timestamps. Even powered off, even wrapped and hidden, the numbers advanced. 1 second at a time. Waiting. The headlights slowed as they crossed the lot, their beams cutting clean, confident paths through the dark. A ranger truck rolled to a stop a few yards away, engine idling, the sound grounding in a way nothing else that night had been. The driver's door opened. Boots hit gravel. A flashlight beam swept once, twice, then settled on me. "Sir?" A voice called, human and strained. "Don't move." I didn't argue. I couldn't have if I wanted to. My legs felt hollow, like they'd already decided they were done for the night. The ranger approached carefully, eyes flicking between me and the tree line, hand resting near his radio. "You alone?" he asked. "Yes," I said. My voice sounded wrong to my own ears, too thin, scraped raw by cold and fear. He nodded, not fully convinced, and gestured for me to come closer to the truck. I moved slowly, deliberately, keeping my hands visible. The forest stayed still. No sound, no pressure. The light held. They wrapped me in a blanket and sat me on the tailgate. Another ranger joined us, younger, quieter, her gaze fixed on the trees beyond the lot. They asked the usual questions. Name, where I'd entered, how long I'd been missing. I answered as best I could, careful with details that felt too fragile to survive daylight. When they asked how I'd found the outpost, I hesitated. "There was a road," I said finally. For a while, they exchanged a look that told me everything they didn't say. The older ranger cleared his throat. "There hasn't been a service road here for years. They drove me out just before dawn. The forest receding in the rearview mirror, trees losing their edges as the sky lightened. I watched until the road curved and the outpost vanished behind us. Only then did my hands start shaking again. At the station, they took my statement. I left out the shapes, the pressure, the sound that wasn't breath. I talked about getting turned around, about finding an old hunting blind, about the trail camera that got their attention. They asked to see it. I handed it over reluctantly, a strange sense of loss twisting in my chest as it left my hands. The younger ranger turned it on, scrolled through the files. Her brow furrowed. The older ranger leaned in closer. Most of the images were gone. Not deleted, corrupted. Blocks of static where frames should have been. Animals dissolved into noise. Empty forest reduced to dark smears. The timestamps jumped erratically, refusing to line up with anything meaningful. But not all of them. The image of the hunter was still there. Pale face, open mouth, waiting eyes. The ranger stiffened when she saw it. "That's him," she said quietly. "That's the guy. They found the missing person notice in their records. Same photo, same jacket, same night 3 years ago. Last ping from his phone somewhere east of the outpost. Never recovered. They asked if I'd found any belongings. I shook my head. They didn't press. I was released later that morning with a ride to my car and a warning about hiking alone. The forest looked harmless in daylight. Birds moved through the trees. Sunlight filtered through leaves, touching everything gently, as if the night had never happened. I drove home without stopping. For a week, I didn't sleep properly. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt that pressure behind them, the sense of being measured, observed. My apartment felt too quiet, every sound too sharp. I kept lights on. I checked corners. I avoided reflective surfaces. The trail camera sat on my kitchen table. They'd given it back to me, apologetic. "Evidence," they said, without explaining what kind. They told me it probably belonged to the hunter, that it would go into storage unless I wanted it. I told them I did. I don't know why. On the 8th night, just after midnight, the camera clicked. I was awake, sitting on the couch, lights on, windows closed. The sound came from the kitchen. I didn't move at first. I listened. No pressure, no smell, just the hum of the refrigerator and the distant rush of traffic outside. I stood slowly and walked toward the table. The camera's red light blinked, steady and familiar. I turned the screen toward me. The newest image showed my kitchen. Same angle, same light. Me standing in the doorway, caught mid-step, face pale, eyes wide. Behind me, reflected faintly in the dark window glass, was the suggestion of a shape that didn't belong to the room. I powered the camera off with shaking fingers. The apartment stayed quiet. I didn't sleep that night. Over the next few days, I tried to get rid of it. I took it to an electronics recycler. The clerk shook his head. "Too old," he said. I left it at a donation center. It showed back up on my doorstep the next morning, placed neatly beside the mat. No note, no explanation. I wrapped it in towels and shoved it into the back of a closet. For a while, that worked. The clicking stopped. The nights grew easier. I started to believe distance mattered, that whatever had watched me was bound to that forest, to that place where the light drew lines it wouldn't cross. Then I noticed the timestamps. Even powered off, even wrapped and hidden, the numbers advanced. 1 second at a time. Waiting. I started measuring time differently after that. Not by clocks or calendars, but by the moments when the camera reminded me it was still aware of me. The apartment felt smaller at night, walls closing in by degrees I couldn't see but could feel in my chest. Every reflective surface became suspect. I turned mirrors to face the wall. I covered windows with blankets. I learned the shape of my rooms by touch in the dark. The camera stayed hidden in the closet. I told myself that was enough. Distance within a space still counted as distance. If I didn't look, if I didn't acknowledge it, whatever rule governed observation might hold. Clicked anyway. Not every night. That was worse. Sometimes days passed without a sound, long enough for me to breathe normally again, to convince myself the timestamps meant nothing. Then, without warning, the familiar mechanical snap would cut through the apartment, precise and calm. The images changed. At first, they were ordinary. My kitchen empty. The couch where I'd fallen asleep, blanket half on the floor. The hallway light left on. Each photo taken from an angle that didn't make sense, too low, too close to the walls, as if the camera had been placed somewhere it physically couldn't be. Then the framing shifted. One image showed my front door from inside the apartment, centered perfectly. The next showed it from the hallway, the number on the doorplate crisp and readable. The timestamp between them was 2 seconds. I checked the locks. twice, then again. The smell came back in small doses. A faint metallic note under the familiar scent of detergent and old wood. It never lingered long enough to prove itself. Just enough to raise my pulse, to make me question whether I'd imagined it. The pressure followed. Not constant, not strong. A subtle fullness behind my ears, like altitude change without ascent. When it came, the camera usually clicked within minutes. I stopped sleeping in my bedroom. I dragged a mattress into the living room, positioning it so no window or dark surface faced me directly. I slept with the lights on. I told myself exhaustion would eventually win. Didn't. On the fourth night like that, I woke to silence so complete it felt artificial. The city noise outside had dropped away entirely. No cars. No distant sirens. Even the refrigerator had stopped humming. The pressure was immediate, sharp enough to make me gasp. The camera clicked. I didn't get up. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, counting my breaths. I told myself that if I didn't move, the image would show nothing new. Just proof that I existed, that I was still where I was supposed to be. The click came again, closer this time. I turned my head slowly and saw the closet door at the end of the hallway standing open. I was sure I had closed it. The dark inside looked thicker than the surrounding shadows, the absence of light layered and deep. I could smell the metal now, clear and undeniable, like old coins held too long in a closed fist. The camera clicked a third time. I sat up. The pressure eased slightly, as if my movement had satisfied a condition. I stood, legs unsteady, and took one step toward the hallway. The apartment felt wrong, stretched, distances subtly off. The hallway seemed longer than it should have been, the door frames farther apart. Another click. I reached the closet and stopped at the threshold. The air inside was cold, colder than the rest of the apartment. The towels I'd wrapped the camera in lay on the floor, neatly folded. The camera sat on the shelf, uncovered, angled outward. It was on. The red light blinked, steady, patient. I picked it up with both hands. The plastic felt warmer than it should have, alive in a way that had nothing to do with heat. I turned the screen toward me. The live view showed the closet interior, then adjusted automatically, widening its angle. The hallway appeared in frame, the living room beyond it. The timestamp held steady. Something shifted in the image. Not entering, not leaving, just resolving. A shape stood behind me in the frame, close enough that its outline overlapped my shoulders. It didn't touch me. It didn't need to. Where it overlapped, the image thinned, my edges blurring as if I were losing priority. The camera clicked and saved the frame. I lowered it slowly and turned around. There was nothing there. The apartment looked normal. The silence broke, city noise rushing back in like a held breath released. My ears rang, then cleared. The smell faded. I sank to the floor, back against the wall, and laughed once, sharp and ugly. I couldn't keep pretending this was about location anymore. The camera didn't belong to the forest. It belonged to observation. I spent the rest of the night experimenting, driven by a calm that felt borrowed. I placed the camera on the table and stepped out of the room. Clicked. I covered it with a towel. Clicked. I shut it in the bathroom and turned off the light. Clicked. Every time I checked the images, I was there, sometimes centered, sometimes partially cut off, sometimes reflected faintly in places where reflections shouldn't exist. Always present. Just before dawn, I noticed something new. In the corner of the newest image, barely visible, was a second timestamp. Smaller, dimmer, counting down. I stared at it until my eyes hurt. When it reached 0, the camera clicked again. The image that replaced it showed my apartment empty. No furniture, no walls, Just a familiar darkness layered with trees that didn't belong there. Trunks pressed too close together, branches overlapping in ways that collapsed distance. In the center of the frame stood the hunting blind, boards gray and waiting, the chair upright inside. The camera clicked once more and powered itself off. Outside, the sky began to lighten. I understood then that the camera hadn't followed me home. It had been preparing a place. And somewhere, just beyond the reach of daylight, the forest was learning the layout of my rooms. Daylight crept in without ceremony. A pale strip along the window seam, then a dull wash that made the apartment look embarrassed of itself. The forest image stayed burned into my eyes long after the camera powered down. When I blinked, I could still see the blind, the chair waiting, the way the trees pressed close as if proximity were a language. I didn't leave the apartment that morning. I sat on the floor with my back to the couch and watched dust drift in the new light. The city woke up around me in fragments. A bus sighed at the corner. Someone laughed on the sidewalk below. Normal sounds stitched themselves back together, but they didn't cover the quiet underneath. They just sat on top of it. I waited for the camera to click. Didn't. Hours passed. Noon came and went. The pressure never returned. No smell. No sound that wasn't accounted for. The camera lay on the table where I'd left it, inert, red light dark, plastic dull. For the first time since the forest, it looked like an object again. That scared me more than the clicking ever had. I packed a bag by mid-afternoon. Not carefully, not thoughtfully, just enough to leave. Clothes, phone charger, wallet. I left the camera where it was. I didn't trust myself to carry it. I didn't trust myself to abandon it either. Some choices felt like traps no matter which way you stepped. I drove until the city thinned and the road widened, the buildings giving way to fields and low hills. I didn't have a destination. I just needed motion that wasn't dictated by something watching from the dark. The sun sank behind me, turning the windshield into a sheet of gold that hurt to look at. I kept driving as the light drained away, watching the mirrors more than the road, half expecting trees to appear where asphalt should have been. They didn't. I stopped at a roadside motel just after full dark, the kind with doors that opened directly onto the parking lot. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a flat, unforgiving glow that made shadows behave. The clerk didn't ask questions. I didn't offer answers. Inside the room, everything smelled like cleaner and old fabric. I sat on the bed and listened. The highway whispered nearby. A truck downshifted. Somewhere water ran through pipes. The night felt ordinary, predictable. I slept. Not deeply, not well, but enough that when I woke, the clock on the nightstand told me time had moved forward honestly. No missing minutes, no pressure behind my eyes, just a dull headache and the ache of muscles that had been too tense for too long. I showered, dressed, and left before dawn fully arrived. The drive back toward the city felt wrong, like retracing steps after a storm had erased the path. I watched the tree lines carefully, measuring their distance from the road. They stayed where they belonged. When I unlocked my apartment door, nothing waited for me on the other side. The camera was gone. The table where I'd left it was empty. No scuff marks, no dust disturbance. Just bare wood and the faint outline where an object had rested long enough to be remembered by light. I searched the apartment anyway. Closet, bathroom, under the bed, behind the couch. Nothing. The absence felt deliberate, curated. A stage cleared after a performance. Relief came in a rush that made me dizzy. I laughed, loud and careless, and the sound echoed properly. I opened windows. I let city noise flood in. I told myself it was over. That night I dreamed of the road. Not the service road from the forest, but the one outside the outpost lot. Gravel pale under artificial light, the boundary where trees refused to cross. In the dream, I stood just beyond that line, holding the camera, watching something pace the edge from the other side. It never stepped into the light. It never needed to. I woke before dawn, heart steady, mouth dry. The dream faded quickly, leaving behind only the sense of being measured. Days passed, then weeks. I went back to work. I stopped flinching at sudden sounds. The mirrors went back on the walls. The blankets came off the windows. Life resumed its shape, if not its weight. I told myself the forest had been a place, not a process. That whatever rules governed observation had limits, jurisdictions. On a quiet evening, I found the envelope in my mailbox. No return address. Thick paper. My name printed neatly on the front, letters too precise to be casual. Inside was a single item, a memory card. I held it between my fingers for a long time, feeling its edges, its small, unassuming weight. The city moved around me. A door slammed somewhere down the block. Someone's radio played faintly from an open window. I didn't go inside. I walked to the nearest park instead, a rectangle of trees and grass tucked between streets. The lights there were bright and regular, spaced evenly along the paths. I sat on a bench beneath one and stared at the card. Curiosity isn't the right word for what I felt. It was closer to obligation, a sense that something unfinished was tugging at a thread that ran through me whether I liked it or not. I slid the card into my phone. The files loaded slowly, thumbnails appearing one by one. Most were corrupted, blocks of gray and black that meant nothing. Then a clear image resolved. The outpost lot at night, the building dark, the light above the door glowing steady. Me standing beneath it, small and human and alive. I scrolled. Another image. The same lot. Same angle. This time, the trees at the edge leaned forward slightly, their shadows overlapping in ways that suggested depth collapsing inward. I scrolled again. The last image was taken from behind the trees, angled toward the lot. The light still held its line. The space between was empty, except for the jacket, laid carefully on the gravel, sleeves pointing in two directions at once, waiting for someone to decide which way counted as leaving. The timestamp pulsed at the bottom of the screen. Current. The park lights flickered once, then steadied. I closed my eyes and listened to the city breathe around me, and somewhere beneath it, far deeper than traffic or wind, I felt the forest take note of where I was sitting now. I didn't run. I didn't stand up. I stayed on the bench and let the phone rest in my hands. Screen dimmed, the image still there even when I wasn't looking at it. The park lights hummed above me, steady and bright, the kind of light designed to reassure. Families walked their dogs along the path. A cyclist passed, tires whispering against pavement. Nothing in the city acknowledged the jacket on the gravel miles away, or the fact that its timestamp was current. I slid the memory card out and held it between my fingers again. It was warm, faintly, like it had been in use too long. The obligation I felt wasn't curiosity. It was continuity, a sense that the act of noticing had already happened, and everything after was just maintenance. I walked home at a normal pace. The apartment greeted me the way it always had, lights reflecting off glass, familiar smells settling into place. I locked the door, set the memory card on the table, and sat across from it. Midnight passed without ceremony. Time behaved. At 12:07, my phone buzzed with a notification. A new file had been added. I didn't open it right away. I went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. The tap hissed, then settled. The floor was cool under my feet. I drank slowly, grounding myself in the simple mechanics of staying alive. At 12:10, the lights flickered. Not out. Just a brief dip, like a blink. The pressure returned then, soft but unmistakable. Not enough to hurt, enough to be felt. The smell followed, faint and metallic, threading through the apartment as if carried on a draft that didn't exist. I sat back down and opened the file. The image showed the park bench from across the path. Me, seated under the light, shoulders hunched, face turned slightly away. The framing was careful, respectful. The trees at the edge of the park leaned inward by a degree that would have been unnoticeable if you weren't looking for it. I scrolled. Another image 2 seconds later. Same angle. The light above the bench still held, but its halo had thinned. The trees had leaned a fraction more, their shadows overlapping where they hadn't before. I didn't scroll again. Instead, I opened the window. City air rushed in, carrying exhaust and distant rain and the layered noise of people who didn't know they were being cataloged by anything but each other. The smell retreated. The pressure eased. I understood then what the camera had been teaching me, patiently, without instruction. Observation wasn't a doorway. It was a contract. The forest hadn't followed me because it wanted me back. It had followed me because I had proven I could be counted. Framed, placed in relation to light and shadow. The hunter had learned it too late. He had stood too close to the edge, trusted a place where rules changed by degrees instead of declarations. I picked up the memory card and snapped it in half. The sound was small, anticlimactic. Plastic giving way. Metal bending. I dropped the pieces into the trash and took the bag out immediately, carrying it down the stairs and into the street. I didn't look back at the apartment while I did it. I didn't need to. That night passed without further incident. The next morning, the park was ordinary again. The bench empty. The trees upright. No jacket on any gravel anywhere I could see. The missing person notice stayed missing. The forest kept its distance. Weeks have gone by since then. I don't hike anymore. I avoid parks after dark. I keep my curtains open and my lights on, not out of fear, but out of courtesy. I don't place myself at edges. I don't linger where light ends. Sometimes, late at night, I hear a soft click from somewhere outside the apartment. A sound so familiar it almost feels comforting. When that happens, I don't move. I don't look. I let the moment pass unrecorded. Because I know now that survival wasn't about being found. It was about choosing when not to be seen.